Hey everyone, Scott here to discuss Daredevil, not the TV series from Netflix. I'll get to that when I get to the MCU, unless if you want me to do it. And the movie version, starring Ben Affleck, Jennifer Gardner, Michael Clark Duncan, Colin Farrell, Joe Pantoliano, Jon Favreau, and David Keith, and directed by Mark Steven Johnson. Now, when this movie came out in Valentine's Day of 2003, I was 12 at the time when this movie came out. And this movie, I remember I was looking forward to because it was another Spider-Man movie and I remember seeing the trailers a year before I saw another movie, and then as soon as the music starts bumping up, it scared the crap out of me. So what did I think of the movie then and now? Well, I'll talk about then. I remember enjoying it, but what did I think of it now? Let's get into the review. Daredevil dropping into a church, and he sees and relives his past as he almost dies. I was kind of just okay with it because it's an origin story. Young Matt Murdock, played by Scott Terra, in the director's cut says that the bullies that were giving him a hard time, and his dad, Jack the Devil Murdock, played by David Keith, saying that they were, and he says in the director's cut that they gave him some shit, and Jack tells him to walk away and give me a break. But young Matt doesn't say it in the theatrical cut, so that's good, I guess. I'll discuss the differences later. Also in the director's cut was Matt trying to find his dad at the construction site and drops his report card and then sees his dad beating up some guy up, and Matt turns blind and says his dad is not only blind, but he can hear everything as well. Whereas in the theatrical cut, we don't see Matt trying to find his dad, and we first see him beating the guy up, and he goes blind, and then that was a dumb move by the director in my mind. Well, let me just confess something right now. The director's cut was more the director's vision. The theatrical cut was more like Fox's decision, so yeah, you can put the blame on Fox on why the movie was bad enough as it was. Let's get going. We see Stan Lee crossing the street, and Matt gets into a fight next scene with the bullies that give him a shit earlier in the movie. In the director's cut, the fight goes on for like a minute in the theatrical cut. In the director's cut, or let me just rephrase this. In the director's cut, the fight goes on for like a minute, whereas in the theatrical cut, it goes like for 30 seconds or so to beat them up. I'm starting to think I like the theatrical cut better than the director's cut, but I'll explain the most differences. There's 30 extra minutes of movie, and it's a little bit darker than it ever was in the theatrical cut in my mind. So, I don't know, I kind of like the theatrical cut a little bit better, but hey, but I do like the TV show better, though. But I'll get to that next year. Jack gets killed by a kingpin named Wilson Fisk, played by Michael Clark Duncan, who I was a fan of before he passed away, which poor bastard. And, I've always enjoyed his presence on screen, but the only thing that's different from this movie compared to the comic book is that the Kingpin's supposed to be white. And I'm not going to go anywhere further than that, because that's going to be a little bit racist. Ben Affleck as the adult version of Matt Murdock was not the greatest casting choice, but I really didn't mind him as Matt Murdock. I didn't mind him as Bruce Wayne when I get to that later this year. I've liked such movies of his, and I'm going to show you pictures of, such as another person I didn't mind in this movie was, and this is just the actor in my opinion, is Jon Favreau as Foggy Nelson, and he directed a movie that I'm going to get to later this year called When I Get to the Avengers series. Now, he plays Foggy Nelson here, Matt's partner at his lawyering by day. business by day in the daytime, whereas at night Matt is Daredevil, which when he puts on the suit, let me just say something right off the bat. He looks kind of silly at a point when people reacted to Thomas Jane as the Punisher, which I'll get to later this year. Which that point, Daredevil's suit is much sillier than the Punisher with Thomas Jane ever did, is the point. Joe Pantoliano as Ben Urich is a good presence, like Michael Clark Duncan, but I didn't really like his character that much because, he's just a total asshole. And I'm afraid that's not a good reason to not like a character, but it's just my opinion. But I am a fan of Mr. Pantoliano, to be clear. Jennifer Garner as Elektra Natchios. Now, I know this actress originally from this TV show called Alias. No, I'm not going to put out a picture of that one, from 2001. And I always thought she was attractive in general, but she's almost miscast as a badass warrior. We'll talk more about that next week when I get to Elektra. The Kingpin, aka Wilson Fisk, in the director's cut, he kills off 2 of his bodyguards, was not only brutal, but as he's roaring to snap his bodyguard's neck, to be honest, he looked very silly in a bad way. We also get introduced to Bullseye, played by Colin Farrell, who is another actor I've seen in movies before. Well, I love this actor, but when we first see him throwing the game spikes and kills off a man and never misses until he meets Daredevil, but he's not as good character as a villain. But I do like his performance in here. That may be the only thing I'll like at this point. Matt's vision of Elektra, where it's all blue and bad looking, because blind people can't see blue. They just see nothing, I thought, from what I'm understanding it to be. I mean, I'm not an expert on blind people, so bear with me. The theatrical cut, Matt stays with Elektra after he beats up a mugger, and he says to a kid, "I'm not the bad guy." But Matt doesn't leave Elektra in the theatrical cut to beat up a mugger. In the director's cut, though, he does. And it makes me like him less than I do at this point, which is kind of a shame. Karen Page is barely in this movie, played by Ellen Pompeo, who was in such movies as Moonlight Mile and Old School. It's kind of a waste of an actress that I like in movies usually. She deserves better than this, in my opinion, although she is on Grey's Anatomy right now, I think. Other than Fisk and Bullseye and Urich and somewhat Matt, kind of, I don't really care for the characters. I mean, oh wait, what am I saying? I don't like Urich. They're rude and too stupid to realize how dumb this plot sounds. This is the movie where Ben Affleck and Jennifer Garner decided they wanted to date each other. Well, this is a year after Jennifer Lopez and Ben and Jennifer Lopez ever divorced. And they got married and have kids and unfortunately divorced each other years later when Batman v Superman comes out. But they had a good chemistry as lovers. The first fight between Daredevil and Bullseye was too quick and cheap looking. Especially the CGI of Daredevil flipping as he kicked Bullseye out of the motorcycle. And Bullseye throwing Daredevil's stick at Elektra's father was again cheap looking in my mind. The scene between Fisk and Bullseye was golden in my opinion, where they're in his office. Fisk's office, let me say. Especially in the theatrical cut, Bullseye says, "I want a bloody costume," as in the director's cut, he says, "I want a fucking costume." I love the soundtrack in the movie, especially 2 Evanescence songs that they play here. Seriously, I like the soundtrack. It's not a bad soundtrack. It's awesome, I feel like. Kevin Smith shows up for one scene where he shows Urich Daredevil's stick and almost pokes his face out, which is really just dangerous. And I'm not a big Kevin Smith fan after seeing the god-awful movie he directed called Tusk, about a crazy old man who turns a young podcaster into a walrus. Yes, I said it! A walrus. My question for next week's movie is Elektra's death was, how did she survive the stab that Bullseye gave her in the movie next week? And she's alive in next week's movie. We'll find out by that point. The second fight between Daredevil and Bullseye is at the church. The CGI looks really bad, and I've never seen CGI that bad at that point where it got very green screen. The fight between Daredevil and Kingpin in the theatrical cut is brief, whereas the director's cut, it's a little bit brutaler. Well, not brutaler, but it's brutal. But it goes on a little longer, and Daredevil kicking Kingpin's knees, ugh, that's gotta hurt like hell. But the fight is brief and half-assed in both cuts, I feel like. Now, time to give the movie a rating. I'll give it a 4.0 out of 10. It's baffling to see the CGI looking pretty bad, and not caring for the characters is rather sad, and the movie is outrageous on keeping it seriously. And the effects, I mean, they're just silly for 2003, and that's a shame, to be honest with you guys. So I'll thank you guys for joining me for Daredevil, and I will be back next week for Elektra. And until next time, I hope justice is found here today, or justice finds you.